Last week, the German government undertook one of the largest terror raids in its modern history. 3,000 police officers swooped in and arrested over 50 suspects. All of these suspects were members of the mysterious Reichsbürger movement, who, among other things, call for the return of the German monarchy. Joining me to talk about this curious story is Spike's Germany correspondent, Sabine Beppler-Spahl. Sabine, thanks so much for coming on the show.
A pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So, first of all, Sabine, can you just tell us a bit about who these Reichsbürger are and what do they want?
Well, they're an odd sort of group, conspiracy theorists, you might say. They claim that the modern German state doesn't really legally exist. They were apparently founded around about in the 1980s. They have connections to old aristocratic families, saying that Germany, as it was sort of founded after the First World War, not the Second World War, but the First World War, is an illegal construct. Some of them at least say they would like to move back to the old kind of monarchical form. They demand that Germany gets the Kaiser back, and they think that would be a much better form of rule. They also believe there is a sort of deep state within the state. Our politicians are illegitimate rulers. Some of them are even engaged in printing their own passports. And they declare their homes as free zones, free of the German state influence.
And you've sort of hinted there that there's a kind of conspiratorial aspect to this. I mean, is it fair to say that this movement has grown, particularly around the kind of COVID pandemic, alongside those other conspiracy theories that people will know about, around the New World Order and things like that?
Yes, definitely. I mean, that's what we hear and we read, that they had a massive boost in the past 2 or 3 years. So they've grown from 19,000 people in around 2019 to almost over 23,000 people within Germany. That these are the official police figures. These are, of course, all estimates. But it was the first time they sort of presented themselves in a bigger way in the public was during the anti-COVID or the anti-lockdown demonstrations. And I have to say, even I was quite surprised because I joined one of these demonstrations in August 2020 just to see what was going on. And I was very, very surprised to see so many of their flags and people of Reichsbürger seemingly coming from all corners. So they seem to have gotten a bit of a boost through that, through the kind of authoritarian handling of this COVID pandemic, which seemed to confirm their ideas that the state was acting against people's interest and was doing things which were very much illegal.
Now, these people have been arrested on suspicion of plotting essentially a coup to overthrow the German government, install one of their own as essentially the Kaiser of Germany. I mean, how realistic do you think that is? Do you think it really warrants the kind of response we've seen from the authorities and also the sort of political response?
Well, it was actually 23 people, I think, now, which are in prison or which are being investigated and have been arrested. No, I don't think that. I think it was definitely an overreaction, and I'm not the only one to think that. So there've been more and more articles coming through, even within the mainstream press. We've had quite a senior former judge who's just published an article in Der Spiegel saying they were not a threat to the state as it was presented to us. So it's odd to think that a group of people, even if there's 23,000 sympathizers, would be able to take over the German state. They can, of course, as every strange group, conspiratorial group, they can cause damage, so there's no doubt about that. So there was talks about them attacking an electricity grid. And they can, of course, also cause damage to individual policemen. So we've had policemen who have been attacked and who have been killed, actually, by individual sympathizers of that kind of movement. Many of them do have weapons, so they can cause harm. But the idea that they could have overthrown the German state, I think, by now is pretty much even consensus that that was not the case, that was never really on the cards.
So in whose interest do you think it is to perhaps overplay this threat? Because it hasn't, in a sense, they've tried to drag in, the German government has tried to drag the AfD into this to say that they have some sort of culpability or some sort of connection to the Reichsbürger. Do you think it's a kind of almost quite an authoritarian ploy from the government to suggest that this is bigger than it really is?
Yeah, well, I mean, this AfD thing came in after the whole action. So at first it was only directed against Reichsbürger. And then because one of the senior people who was arrested, in fact, a female judge who was a former MP of the AfD, because of that connection, people have then been saying, some quite senior politicians have been saying that this indicates that the AfD is the breeding ground for these kind of right-wing groups. And then said, well, we need to, so there have actually been talks about banning the AfD. So we've had the minister-president of North Rhine-Westphalia saying we really have to look at a complete ban of this party because it is spreading that kind of ideology. And of course, when people say these things, it's hard not to see that there is a certain political interest in it because they've always had the AfD as their main enemy. So they've been anti-populist. The AfD has always been a bit of a trouble and a problem. And there've been a lot of talks about the AfD gaining support in these difficult times we're going through. So energy crisis, people feeling the squeeze, the inflation, and we have some elections coming up, local elections, and there is a very real fear of the AfD gaining ground again. So surveys show that they have picked up. And so, it's very hard not to get the impression that there is a certain interest in going against your political enemies by using the force of law and by making that connection between Reichsbürger and the AfD.
And one of the words that has come up a lot in relation to this is talk of Germany's defensive democracy, or wehrhafte Demokratie. I wonder if you could explain what that means and kind of its authoritarian implications.
So this is a concept which goes back to the end of the Second World War, after fascism, when Germany was when democracy was being reintroduced, let's say, to Germany. And it was a concept which goes back to the Allies and, of course, local Germans who said, well, the German people have shown that they are maybe not the best of democrats. And if we do want to, democracy is the only way forward, we need to ensure that democracy is secured against its enemies. So saying that we can't allow the enemies of democracy to use democratic means to overthrow democracy. That was basically the idea behind it. The basic idea behind it, of course, is a very deep distrust of the people, saying, normally you would say democracy is the best guarantee against radical ideas flourishing, because you would trust normal people's ability to make sense of the world and to say, well, we don't want to go for weird ideas. But here they were saying, no, we need some more checks and balances. And that this gave the German state legally the right to go against extremists of all kinds. It's important to say it's not actually being used only against right-wing extremists, but actually against left-wing extremists too. So one of the first parties which was banned under the wehrhafte Demokratie notion was actually the KPD, the communists in the 1950s. Yes, and whenever a politician says these are people who go against the principles of the federal state, then that you would have the right to ban them and to say that they don't comply to our democratic rules. The problem is that, of course, it can be used. It's a very vague concept, so it's not only being used against people who use arms and storm the actual parliament. So you don't need actual violence, but even just speech saying we questioning the legality of Germany's system, as the Reichsbürger are doing, as is the case with the Reichsbürger. And then you'd be allowed to ban a group, which is, of course, a very, very authoritarian way of approaching a problem rather than, challenging political ideas. You use the power of the state to go against them. It's basically protecting democracy from the people. That's really what it is.
That's a really great summary. Sabine, thank you very much.